All right, so buckle up because today we're going across the border, figuratively speaking, of course. Get this, back in 2012, over 10 million people living in Mexico, which is like almost 9% of their whole population, were heading up to the U.S. to do their shopping.
Wow, 10 million. That's a lot of people crossing the border just to go shopping.
It is, right. Makes you wonder, what's the deal with that? Why are so many people going through the hassle of crossing an international border just to buy stuff?
Got to be more than just convenience, right? There's got to be a bigger story there.
You hit the nail on the head. And luckily, we've got some experts who dove deep into this. We're looking at a study called Análisis de las compras de los consumidores mexicanos en .pdf, and the authors are Eliseo Diaz-Gonzalez and Gabriel Gonzalez-Koenig. These guys didn't just skim the surface. They crunched a ton of household spending data from 2012 to figure out what's really going on.
So they were using real data, not just guesswork.
Real data, detailed models, the whole 9 yards. They even brought in this idea of fiscal competition, which we'll get to in a bit.
Sounds intense.
It is, but that's why we're here to break it down for you. We're not going to bombard you with jargon and statistics. We're going to pull out the key insights, the stuff that really matters, so you can understand what's driving this cross-border shopping phenomenon.
So why it's happening, what people are buying, and how it all fits into the bigger economic picture.
Exactly. By the end of this, you'll be able to hold your own in any conversation about this, whether it's at the dinner table or in a boardroom.
Speaking of the bigger picture, isn't it interesting how something as everyday as shopping can give us insights into global trade and international relations?
It really does. It's like a microcosm of how economies interact, right?
Absolutely.
So to give you a roadmap for where we're headed, we're going to hit a few key points. First, we'll look at the economic theories behind all of this, especially this thing called tax competition, which sounds kind of intimidating, but we'll make it clear. Then we'll explore how geography, like being close to the border, and even migration patterns play a role. Of course, we've got to talk about what people are actually buying.
Right.
After that, we'll delve into the impact of things like how open the two economies are and how border controls affect things. We'll also consider how income and other social factors come into play. And finally, we'll wrap up with the big findings from the study.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So let's jump right in. This study talks a lot about tax competition. Now, I know that sounds kind of jargony. Can you break it down for us in plain English? What does tax competition mean when we're talking about people from Mexico shopping in the U.S.?
Well, think of it this way. When two countries are right next to each other, like the U.S. and Mexico, the taxes they charge on stuff, things like sales tax, can be different. And those differences can actually make people want to cross the border to shop where things are cheaper. So if something has a higher sales tax in Mexico than it does in the U.S., well...
people are going to be tempted to hop over the border and get it for less.
Exactly. And it's not just the shoppers who are thinking about this. Governments have to keep this in mind, too. When they set tax rates, they have to consider that if they make taxes too high, people might just go shop somewhere else.
So it's like a balancing act for governments. They want to collect tax revenue, but they also don't want to drive all their shoppers away.
Exactly. They're competing, in a way. And that's where the term tax competition comes from.
Okay, that makes sense. So in this case, if sales tax on certain things is lower in the U.S., that's a pretty big incentive for Mexicans to come here and shop, especially if those things are more expensive back home because of the taxes.
Right. Plus, people are naturally going to try to get the best deal. And if they can save a decent chunk of money by crossing the border, especially if they live nearby, a lot of them are going to do it.
But hold on, it can't be as simple as just lower taxes equals everyone crosses the border, right?
You're right. It's not that simple. It's not just about the tax difference. It's also about how much it costs and how much effort it takes to actually cross that border.
Because even if you save money on the item itself, you've got to factor in things like gas money, time spent traveling, and any potential hassles at the border.
Exactly. So the incentive to cross is strongest when that tax difference is pretty big and the border crossing itself is relatively easy and cheap.
Now let's talk about location. The study emphasizes how important proximity to the U.S. border is, which kind of makes sense, right? The closer you are, the less of a trek it is to get there.
Right. Makes total sense.
And the study's findings actually back that up. The farther people lived from the border, the less likely they were to cross it for shopping.
I mean, that's pretty intuitive. Think about it. If you live right on the border, it's no big deal to pop over for an afternoon of shopping. But if you have to drive for hours or even take a bus, Well, the cost and time start to eat into those savings.
Totally. It's like if you're driving an hour to save 20 bucks on a new TV, maybe it's worth it. But if you're driving all day, that's a different story.
Yeah, you might as well just buy it at home.
Exactly. And in fact, the data from 2012 showed that most of these cross-border shopping trips were starting in Mexican states right along the U.S. border.
Makes perfect sense.
But here's where it gets interesting. It's not just about how close you live. The study also talked about the importance of what they called migratory traditions in certain parts of Mexico. How does that fit into all of this?
So this is a pretty cool finding. Even after accounting for distance, people from states with a long history of migrating to the U.S. were more likely to shop there, regardless of how far they lived from the border.
Yeah.
We're talking about states like Aguascalientes, Durango, Guanajuato, Guerrero, Hidalgo, Michoacán, Nayarit, Oaxaca, San Luis Potosí, and Zacatecas. That's a lot of states.
So even if someone lives in the middle of Mexico, hundreds of miles from the border, if their family has a history of moving to the U.S., they're still more likely to go there to shop.
It's like there's a connection that goes beyond pure geography. It's almost like these migration patterns created these consumption corridors over time.
Okay, now explain that a bit more because that's pretty fascinating.
Well, think about it. When people migrate, they don't just bring their belongings, they bring their habits, their preferences, and their knowledge of the marketplace.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. So if generations of your family have lived in the U.S. or even just visited regularly, you're more likely to be familiar with American brands. You might even prefer them, and you know where to find them.
Makes sense. It's not just about knowing where the stores are. It's about being familiar with the whole U.S. shopping experience.
Exactly. And it's also about information. People in those communities are more likely to have friends or family who can give them the inside scoop on the best deals and the best places to shop in the U.S. And on top of that, you've got to consider remittances.
Remittances.
Yeah, the money that migrants send back to their families. That flow of money back to Mexico can actually boost the purchasing power of those families, making it more feasible for them to shop across the border, even if they live further inland.
Oh, that's really interesting. So migration can actually have a direct impact on the economics of shopping.
It's all connected.
It really is. Okay, so we've talked about why people might choose to cross the border to shop. Now let's get into the specifics. What were they actually buying? The study highlighted a couple of key categories, right?
Yeah, they did. The data from 2012 showed that clothing was consistently a top purchase, whether people lived near the border, far from it, or in one of those high migration states, clothing was always up there.
Wow, so clothing was really in demand.
It was huge. It was like the #1 thing people were crossing the border to buy.
And what was next on the list after clothing?
Electronic appliances. We're talking about everything from personal electronics like smartphones and laptops to larger appliances like televisions, DVD players, and even smaller kitchen appliances.
So it seems like they were going for items where the price difference might be really noticeable or where there might be a wider variety available in the U.S. compared to Mexico.
That's a really good observation. You also have to remember that these are durable goods, things that are meant to last a while. So even if you factor in the cost of the trip, the savings could still be significant in the long run.
Plus, there's also the perception of quality.
Absolutely. People might be drawn to specific American brands that are known for their quality or reliability, or brands that just aren't available in Mexico.
Now, the study also touches on a couple of other factors. How open the economies are and border controls. It almost sounds like there's a bit of a tug of war happening there. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? You'd think that when economies are more open, meaning there's more free trade between them, there would be less need for cross-border shopping.
Yeah.
After all, if more goods are flowing freely between countries, shouldn't everything be more readily available everywhere?
Right, so something like NAFTA should have theoretically reduced the need for people to cross the border to shop.
You'd think so, but that's not quite how it played out. The reality is, even with increased trade, those price differences and tax differences, they still mattered.
Plus, consumer preferences come into play, too.
Exactly. People might just prefer certain U.S. brands, even if similar products are available back home. So open economies, while they increase the flow of goods, don't necessarily eliminate the desire to cross the border for specific things. On the other hand, you've got border controls, which, as you might guess, act as a deterrent.
Yeah, things like needing a visa to enter the U.S. or having to deal with customs when you come back, those can make cross-border shopping a lot more complicated, not to mention more expensive.
Exactly. Having to get a visa is a pretty significant barrier. But the study points out that by 2012, a lot of Mexicans, over 10 million, actually did have valid U.S. visas. especially those in the northern border states. So that made those frequent trips more doable.
And what about customs? I know there are limits on how much you can bring back without having to pay duties. How does that factor in?
Well, the study suggests that the Mexican authorities actually took a bit of a, shall we say, flexible approach when it came to small-scale shopping trips. They mentioned this informal allowance of around $150 per person, which goes up to $300 during holidays. And they point out that this allowance isn't always strictly enforced.
Ah, so a little bit of a wink and a nod.
Maybe so. The researchers think it might be a practical way of managing the situation. Because if they were super strict about it, well, they might end up with a lot more smuggling going on.
Interesting. So it's like they're trying to strike a balance between regulating trade and acknowledging the reality that people who live near the border are going to cross to shop.
Right. It's a tough situation to manage.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's look at the shoppers themselves. The study dug into how things like household income affected their likelihood to cross the border to shop. What did they find?
Well, one of the clearest patterns was that the more money a household made, the more likely they were to engage in cross-border shopping. And this held true across all of Mexico. But the effect was even stronger in the border states.
So basically, while everyone likes a good deal, people with more disposable income have more flexibility to take advantage of cross-border shopping opportunities, especially if they're already living close to the border.
Exactly. They have more money to spend, they can more easily afford the trip, and maybe they're more comfortable navigating the border crossing process. The study also looked at other factors, like education level and whether the head of the household was male or female. But those factors didn't seem to have as much of an impact as income and proximity to the border. Interestingly, though, they did find that households headed by women were slightly more likely to shop across the border.
Oh, that is interesting. Any theories as to why that might be?
Honestly, the study doesn't really delve into the reasons behind that specific finding, but it's fun to speculate.
Yeah.
Maybe it's related to who typically does the grocery shopping, or maybe there are differences in what products men and women prioritize, or where they prefer to shop.
Could be cultural too, right?
Yeah, lots of possibilities. It's definitely something that could be explored further.
Okay, so after all this data crunching and model building, what were the main takeaways? What did the researchers ultimately conclude were the biggest drivers of cross-border shopping back in 2012?
Well, their model pretty much confirmed that tax competition is a real thing. People are definitely drawn to lower prices and the possibility of finding different goods across the border.
Makes sense.
But, and this is important, the strength of that pull weakens as the distance from the border increases.
Because of those added costs and the effort of getting there.
Precisely. And they also found strong evidence that those long-standing migration patterns, that cultural connection to the U.S. that we talked about, is a really big factor. It drives demand for U.S. goods, even among people who live far from the border.
So, to put it simply, it's a mix of financial incentive, saving money, finding different products, and practical considerations: how far you have to travel, how much it costs, and how easy it is to cross the border.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that the influence of family and social ties, the familiarity with the U.S. market, and it creates this complex picture of why people choose to shop across the border.
So let's recap some of the key takeaways for you, our listeners. Proximity to the border was, and likely still is, a major factor driving this trend. The closer you live, the easier and more appealing it is.
Right.
And we also learned that living in one of those Mexican states with a strong history of migration to the U.S., those places we mentioned earlier, well, that also increased the likelihood of shopping in the U.S., likely because of that familiarity and those established social connections.
And let's not forget what they were buying. Clothing and electronics were at the top of the list.
Right. It's also important to remember that while we're talking about millions of people, the overall impact of cross-border shopping on total household spending in Mexico was relatively small. It was around 1.23% of total spending on goods. But in those Mexican cities right along the border, it was a much bigger deal.
Yeah, about a third of household spending there.
Wow, that shows you how intertwined those border economies really are. The study also found that having more money made you more likely to cross the border to shop, no matter where you lived in Mexico. But that effect was amplified if you were already living in a border state.
Right, so money matters, but location matters even more.
It seems so. And lastly, we saw how the Mexican authorities seemed to have a bit of a relaxed approach to those small-scale shopping trips, which might be their way of managing things and preventing a bigger headache of illegal trade.
Smart strategy, really.
It's a fascinating example of how economics and policy intersect in the real world.
It really is. And it all comes back to that idea of tax competition. The pull of lower prices is balanced by the realities of making that trip across the border.
So, as a final thought for our listeners, consider this. Given how influential things like proximity and migration patterns are, how do you think future changes might impact these trends? What if there are big shifts in demographics or changes in border regulations or maybe economic upheavals in either country?
Yeah, those are all factors that could significantly reshape this whole cross-border shopping landscape.
And what about those less obvious factors we didn't even touch on today? Things like brand loyalty, perceptions of quality, or even the simple desire for a different shopping experience. These are all things worth pondering the next time you hear someone talking about trade and economic ties between Mexico and the U.S.
You've given everyone a lot to think about.
Well, that's what we aim for, right?
Always.
Thanks for joining me today, and thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in to this deep dive.
Until next time.
See you then.